All right, y'all. You're Locked On Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And today we are talking about what Jalen Mayfield's potential extended absence means for the competition at left guard, the fact that the Falcons are planning on playing everybody in the preseason, the pros and cons of that, and the most recent addition to the defensive line in Abdullah Anderson and what he is adding to this roster.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, everyone, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years. You formerly at FalcFans.com. Currently still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. So we thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course, also on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, and you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. Give us that hit that bell for all those notifications. So today we're going to start out talking about the ongoing competition along the offensive line. The update is that Jalen Mayfield is expected to be out with a back injury. We didn't get confirmation from Arthur Smith, as we usually don't when it comes to injuries, that this back injury is related to the back injury that he suffered that prevented him from playing in the season finale last year against the Saints. But you can kind of read between the lines when Arthur Smith is talking about, Jalen Mayfield's toughness. It makes it seem like he's been practicing hurt at least these past couple of days, if not past few months or whatever the case may be. Time will kind of tell on how long Mayfield is out of the lineup, given back injuries and hamstring injuries. And these are typically types of injuries that don't just sort of suddenly heal themselves overnight. We can expect he'll probably miss a few more days, if not weeks, of practice. And that's going to certainly matter when it comes to the ongoing position battle at that left guard competition, as we often know and hear. Availability is the best ability, and you can't win a competition if you don't necessarily show up. And so it would be easy to declare Elijah Wilkinson the winner of that left guard competition. He's been getting all the starting reps since the first day of training camp when Mayfield was the starter on day one. But since then, it's been all Elijah Wilkinson with those first team reps. But before, I would say pump the brakes a little bit, because, we have a long way to go between now and the end of camp and final cuts and the season opener against the Saints. A lot can happen over the next 5 weeks. And I've often brought up these examples over the last week or two. I think it makes sense to continue to bring up these examples, just because there's, I think, a tendency for people to want to skip steps in the process and get to the results before understanding how this process goes. And, you go back to the offensive line competitions back in 2015, where James Stone was the prohibitive starter at the left guard position for basically the first month of training camp, then struggled in that third preseason game against the Dolphins. And then that sort of facilitated the Falcons making the move to acquire Andy Levitre to be the new starter there before the season started. Then you had 2019, where Ty Sambrella was getting the bulk of the first team reps at right tackle, then struggled in the second preseason game against the Jets, and that opened the door to Matt Gano, who eventually got hurt as well. And then Caleb McGarry, who basically missed pretty much all of training camp dealing with the heart condition, but that opened the door for him to sort of swoop in at the last second and win that competition. And you can even point to last summer with Josh Andrews getting the bulk of the snaps, those starting snaps at left guard last summer, and then sort of a broken hand or broken finger or whatever it was that opened the door for Jalen Mayfield to come in and start that. And, I know a lot of people say, the Falcons always intended for Josh Andrews to be the starter. I don't really believe that. I think the intention was for Jalen Mayfield to win that competition. But as the Falcons, as was made clear in practice and in preseason, like, the best guy should win. And unfortunately for the Falcons, Josh Andrews, who was the 91st best guard in the NFL in 2020, the previous year, wound up being the better guy than Jalen Mayfield. And so that led to all of its issues. So I say all that not to dunk on Josh Andrews or not to dunk on Jalen Mayfield, but ultimately to prove the point that preseason games are going to matter a ton when in these competitions for obvious reasons. Because you're not really going all out in practice. Arthur Smith talked about this the other day where he was highlighting a rep that Lorenzo Carter had that, rewatching the film of practice would have been credited a sack, but in practice didn't result in the sack in part because, Lorenzo Carter was bull rushing one of the offensive linemen and could have in a real game, in a real setting, pushed him into the quarterback and, gotten that sack in a real sense, but pulled off at the last second for obvious reasons, given that you're not allowed to basically touch the quarterback in practice. And in a game setting it would have been very different in practice. So practice is important, but it's not the full thing. An analogy that I will now use is like, you can think of practice as the sparring, if depending on what combat sport you want to think, boxing, MMA, whatever. Preseason is kind of the undercard. It's a fight, but it's not necessarily the main event, and the regular season is obviously the main event. And while sparring matters, it's getting you prepared to do the fight. Ultimately you're going to have to go out there and actually win the fight in these preseason games. And we know preseason isn't the same as the regular season because it's vanilla schemes, it's vanilla concepts, or whatever the case may be. You're just trying to execute the basics of the offense rather than making the in-game adjustments and game planning for specific opponents like you would do in the regular season. So it's all building towards one or the other. And so based off of that, there's clearly a precedent where, even though Elijah Wilkinson may probably is probably a good bet that he'll get the majority of the first team snaps in the coming weeks. Should he struggle, should others struggle along the offensive line, it does open the door for others to come in and swoop in and win this left guard position. And as I've used in the previous examples, it is not the first time that would have happened in the Falcons training camp. And of course, I know there's a lot of people that are still hoping for the idea that the Falcons bring in a veteran to solidify this left guard position. Quentin Spain's a name that has been brought up a ton over the last couple of months and or weeks. And while that move doesn't seem imminent at this point in time, there's certainly a reality where if Wilkinson struggles in these preseason games, he pulls a James Stone, he pulls a Ty Sambrailo, right, and stinks in the preseason, then that opens the door for the Falcons to go and get someone who can solidify that position, and Quentin Spain can basically be the new Andy Levitri. And so I'm curious for those of you that are, following along, Falcon fans as well, sort of where do you kind of fall in that? Or like hoping that certain additions, certain players can be added to this roster, and do you kind of hope that things kind of get worse in order to facilitate that happening later this summer, like a Quentin Spain and elsewhere on this team? So I'm curious how you guys approach that thing. Are you kind of hoping that the current group of players that the Falcons have at some of these question mark positions, like left guard and others, are just good enough to kind of tread water throughout the preseason and inspire you with confidence? Okay, these guys will be okay heading into the regular season. Again, I'm no offense to Elijah Wilkinson, but I don't think many people are expecting him to be good. Like basically, my hope is like he can be James Carpenter good, which is not good, but like at least you're not losing sleep over that position. Or are you kind of hoping that history kind of repeats itself, and these guys will struggle in the preseason, and then that will sort of prompt the Falcons to go out there and add a Quentin Spain or add whatever the 2022 version of an Andy Levitri is moving forward. So of course, leave a comment here on Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Send me an email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can hit me up on social media on Locked On Falcons, either on Facebook or Twitter, to let me know sort of where you sort of stand on that. But speaking of guys doing good things or bad things in the preseason games, we'll talk about the pros and cons of knowing that Arthur Smith, as he has made aware and clear these last couple of months, that we're going to actually see these starters play in the preseason game. Everybody's going to play in the preseason game, and we'll break down sort of what's good and bad about that as we continue today's episode. But guys, before we get there, I do want to talk about a situation that many of us have been in when money has been a little tight and you're worried about some unexpected expenses coming up. I know for me, a lot of that in the past has been tied to worrying about my car and the maintenance on that car, given it's an older make and model. And that's not cheap. As time wears on, those maintenance expenses go up. But now I have Dave to help me out of those stressful situations. And Dave is not a person. Dave is a banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. There's no interest, no credit check needed. Millions have already downloaded the Dave app, and you can too. Just head on over to the App Store and download Dave. That's DAVE. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve, member FDIC. Your future you will thank you. So we got the confirmation that we kind of suspected all along, or at least believed would likely be the case, that Arthur Smith says everybody will play this preseason. At least everybody that's healthy will play this season. Obviously, different players will have a different plan. But using sort of that undercard analogy that we just discussed with the preseason, maybe some of these guys, Jake Matthews or Cordero Patterson, they might fight one round in that undercard match, while other guys will be expected to sort of go the distance in that. And so we'll see what develops on Friday when the Falcons kick off their preseason schedule against the Detroit Lions. And we'll actually get some of the first glimpses of this quote unquote new look offense helmed by Marcus Mariota and others later this week. And obviously, as the week unfolds, we'll break down sort of some of the specifics that myself and others will be looking forward to. The aforementioned offensive line is certainly going to be near or at the top of the list for me personally in terms of things that I'll be focusing on in that preseason game. But originally, when I was thinking about what I was going to talk about on today's episode, I was originally thinking, okay, I'll come on and we'll finally talk about Marcus Mariota. But to be honest with you, like I just couldn't find anything compelling to say about Marcus Mariota. And we talked about this all the way back in March, that it's very likely that Marcus Mariota will be the least discussed quarterback on probably any of these Locked On podcasts, at least among the starters. Um, because I just don't have that much thoughts on Marcus Mariota. And it's not a shot at Marcus Mariota, but it's just like he's a league average quarterback. That's what he's been throughout his NFL career. Like if you look at the NFL average in terms of adjusted net yards per attempt since Mariota joined the league in 2015, it's been 6.19. Mariota's career, adjusted net yards per attempt is 6.13. You look at Matt Ryan, the last 3 years combined, it's 6.18. And so part of it for me, for Mariota, while I think he's a perfectly capable quarterback, has had a perfectly solid camp and looks like he's well on his way to being a decent quarterback for the Falcons moving forward, I can't get excited about Marcus Mariota in the same ways that other people do, because to me, it kind of the best case scenario, maybe not the best case scenario, but one of the better outcomes that we're going to have is just basically having a lateral move to what we've had the last couple of years out of Matt Ryan. And so, if we'd been dealing with Sam Darnold for the last 3 years, it would be a different conversation. But we've had average quarterback play these last couple of years. I expect we'll get average quarterback play for the fourth year in a row. So I'm not going to spend that much time or that much energy trying to gas you up that it's going to be dramatically different than what it has been the last couple of years. And that's nothing personal against Marcus Mariota. I just feel like when we talk about the quarterback situation, the far more compelling conversation, centers on Desmond Ridder and his development. Can we develop him into more than a league average quarterback? And that's obviously going to take years to come into fruition. So time will tell on that. But, for me personally, talking about the preseason, I'm much more compelled and interested to see what Desmond Ridder can do in Friday's matchup, because I expect he'll get the majority of those snaps. And so hopefully we'll see some flashes of Desmond Ridder looking like he's going to, obviously Rome wasn't built in a day, as I said, years to come to fruition, but, hopefully you get some flashes in the meantime. And so, he's near the top of the list of the guys that I'm eager to watch in the preseason. And of course, I'm eager to see what Mariota can do. Is he, Matt Schaub-esque in terms of game management, or is he out there, making plays in a preseason game that's going to, generate that buzz that I'm sure many Falcon fans are eagerly anticipating this team can start to do this upcoming season. And so we'll see how that plays out. But one of the downsides of everybody playing the preseason is it does open the door for greater injury risk with some of these players, and that was the number one reason cited by Arthur Smith of why he was reluctant to play many of the starters and many of the players that we knew going into the summer were likely to make the roster, the sort of the locks or the near locks. Very few of those guys played really much in the preseason last year. And I think it was owed to the Falcons being concerned about their thin depth. And Arthur Smith has talked about this in recent days and weeks. And, obviously if guys are going to play, even though they're going to be on sort of pitch counts and snap counts, it does open the door for more injury risk. And I know some people are don't like me talking about those things and saying, oh, you're talking about injuries and you're jinxing it. And it's like, my reaction to that is like, stop being naive, guys. Football is one of the most violent sports ever invented by human beings. And so me not talking about it doesn't make it less violent. And so doesn't necessarily make those injury risks go away. So we obviously hope for the best. We obviously hope and pray we'll do everything we can, on our end of the spectrum to, put our hands together and hope that we don't suffer those injuries. But obviously, if they do occur, and eventually we will see injuries, whether hopefully they won't be in the preseason, but they will eventually come in the regular season. Hopefully they won't be too dramatic, and hopefully the Falcons will do a great job navigating those issues moving forward. We know last year they had to deal with the Ridley situation, Isaiah Oliver, as well as other injury issues, but primarily their strategy was next man up, and that strategy made total sense given some of their cap constraints, and they couldn't necessarily go out there and make too many big splashes to upgrade those positions. But now they're not as constrained via the cap when it comes to that stuff. So, as we talked about with some of the other question mark positions like the offensive line, I'm curious to see if this team is going to be a lot more aggressive should injuries happen. Again, we're not hoping for that, but should they happen, to address some of these issues and attack some of these issues. So we'll see. We'll keep our fingers crossed in that regard. But the Falcons are already making moves to address some of these injuries by signing a defensive lineman named Abdullah Anderson on Sunday to sort of fill the vacancy left by Vincent Taylor. And we'll talk about what Anderson is going to bring to the table to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But before we get there, I'll plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you can find 3 shows with 4 hosts: A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanisha Batiste, breaking down not only local teams, but national sports headlines, all on the same podcast feed, same ones that you listen and or watch Locked On Falcons. And if you're watching Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you'll also get access to the Locked On Braves postcast, breaking down every Atlanta Braves win and loss. And this week, you will be able to also check out the Locked On Falcons postcast coming at you on Friday evening after the Falcons Lions preseason game. And that will be something that will continue throughout the summer and the fall this year, as myself and Jarvis Davis will be giving you that lowdown each and every Sunday and occasionally on Thursday, and in the summer on Fridays and whatever days the preseason games are, all on the same feed. So go check out Locked On Sports Atlanta. Make sure you subscribe to it on YouTube so you don't miss that, and subscribe to it on your preferred podcast platform. And guys, speaking of this preseason game, the Falcons are favored over the Lions by 2.5 points. It's one of the few opportunities that you may have to bet on the Falcons as favorites this season, since we know at least in the regular season they will not be favored in, or they are currently not favored in, a ton of games. So why not head on over to the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info at betonline.net to take advantage of that. BetOnline has the latest odds, contests, player props, whatever you want. They have it, whether you want to bet on football, baseball, UFC, boxing, esports, Vegas casino games, NBA, NHL. BetOnline has it all. So head on over to the website to take advantage of the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. So the Falcons picked up a guy that probably normally most people would look at as a camp body in Abdullah Anderson, a defensive lineman. But given how thin the Falcons are currently on their interior defensive line, Anderson has a better than average chance of sticking on this roster than typically you would expect of a guy being signed, the second or third week of training camp. And, you couple that with the fact that Anderson does have some playing time experience over these last couple of years, means that he's not your typical camp body that's sort of an undrafted free agent or a guy that's sort of bounce around the practice squad. He has bounced around the practice squad quite a bit over the years. But he can help shore up some of the depth. Obviously, he's a replacement for Vincent Taylor, the defensive tackle that tore his Achilles last week, and he officially went on the injured reserve on Sunday. So he is obviously out for the season. Anderson is notable to me because I recall him being an undrafted free agent back in 2018, coming out of Bucknell. He tested particularly well, and I thought he was going to be on the Falcons' radar for that reason, obviously, because the Falcons favor athleticism, but also that 2018 offseason, I think, was also the offseason where often I would say, the Falcons and 49ers and Seahawks all like the same players. And I know the Seahawks and 49ers kind of worked out Anderson. So I was like, he's definitely on the Falcons' radar for that reason. He wound up signing as an undrafted free agent with the Bears. Not a surprise, given the various moves the Falcons have made. With that regard, he wound up, sort of bouncing up and down off their practice squad for those next two seasons in 2018 and 2019. Did play a couple of games with the Bears in 2019. I think had a sack that year. Then was cut the following summer by the Bears, scooped up by the Vikings, played one game with them that season, then kind of bounced around the league with a couple of teams, did wind up playing 3 games late last year with the Packers, spent some time with the Steelers, spent some time with the Titans in the intervening year. So we'll see if he can, add something to the mix here on this defensive line where we don't have that much experience outside of basically Grady Jarrett. Vincent Taylor was the most experienced player, and he's now gone. And we'll sort of see, if Abdullah is sort of the last of the additions on the defensive line. And again, we've talked about this a ton since Eddie Goldman's retirement. But I think a lot of us hope and expect the Falcons to make more significant moves, more bigger splashes than Abdullah Anderson. No offense to him along this defensive line, given how thin they are. But as I said last week when Taylor went down with that Achilles injury, I think we have to be patient with that. I think this team wants to see what some of these young guys, whether it's Abdullah Anderson or Nick Thurman or Derek Tangelo, can do. So I think we have to be patient with that regard, and we'll see what some of these guys can do in the preseason game to see if they can sort of give us a little bit more hope that some of these young guys will be able to step up in this sort of next man up mentality that the Falcons are dealing with. And so I think they want to see and evaluate these guys in the preseason games before they make any sort of major moves along that front. That will be probably a late August or early September types of moves rather than something that we'll see, in the early part of August that we currently are. So similar conversation that we're talking about with the left guard position, where if you're holding out hope for a Quentin Spain, that move is probably not going to happen anytime soon until we get to see some of these guys in the preseason. So we'll see how that develops, and we'll see what develops for the rest of the week. Guys, here on Locked On Falcons, we'll be joined tomorrow with Will McFadden of the Believe in Falcons podcast. Will used to cover the Falcons for the official site at AtlantaFalcons.com years ago, now doing the podcast over at Believe in Falcons with a personal favorite of mine and Ovi Mahaley, his co-host there. And so Will be joining us tomorrow to talk about his observations from training camp as well as what he's eager to see this week in the preseason action. And then we'll be joined later this week by Jarvis Davis, the co-host of the Falcons postcast on the Locked On Sports Atlanta, to get his thoughts on what he expects to see in the preseason. And maybe we'll be able to do some Locked On Lions crossover. We haven't done a crossover in a very long time, since early January, or I guess technically we did a crossover when the Matt Ryan trade happened. But hopefully we'll be doing better with this crossover. So we'll see if we can link up with Matt Derry of Locked On Lions to talk about what both of these teams will be looking to accomplish in this upcoming undercard match known as the preseason, guys. But that will do it for us here. We thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day on their preferred podcast platform, and always have recommendations for your second listen in addition to Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks. Why not check out the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast, where host Vinny Iyer is bringing you 20 years of NFL expertise to help you get prepped for this upcoming fantasy season, your upcoming fantasy drafts. Just because the Falcons probably aren't a great bet to be playoff teams this year doesn't mean that you can't make the playoffs this year. And check out Locked On Fantasy Football on your preferred podcast platform, including on YouTube. So guys, I really appreciate it. We'll have more coverage here as training camp unfolds for the Falcons. Appreciate it. Till then.